Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a quieter age. So, go ahead and settle in. Adjust your pillows, dim the lights, and let the day slowly fade. We're going to spend some time wandering through the dust and scrolls of the ancient world. Not the exciting, sword-swinging kind of history. No, we're focusing on something gentler. Paper. Clay tablets. The smell of old papyrus in a room where some underpaid scribe tried very hard to spell every word correctly. We're talking about forgotten libraries. Ancient collections of knowledge that, in many cases, didn't make it to our time, either because people burned them, or because, as usual, they just neglected them until the roof fell in. So let's start drifting back. The very idea of a library in the ancient world feels almost too modern. After all, we like to think of libraries as inventions of civilization at its most enlightened. But humans, being humans, were collecting and hoarding things long before we came up with card catalogs. The earliest libraries weren't quiet sanctuaries of learning. They were more like glorified storerooms where kings kept their loot of tablets and scrolls. Take, for example, one of the first known collections of writing, the Library of Ebla. This was in what's now Syria, around 2500 BCE. It sounds very grand when you say Library of Ebla, but in practice it was several rooms filled with clay tablets that had been conveniently baked hard by a fire that destroyed the palace. Tragic for the city, excellent for historians. Thousands of administrative records, letters, and lists survived because the place accidentally set itself on fire. Which really sums up ancient archival methods. Don't worry about climate control, just pray for a destructive blaze at the right moment. Naturally, these weren't bedtime reading texts. No one was curling up with a tablet of barley rations and thinking, how relaxing. But they show something important. Rulers liked to keep records, partly because they were obsessive, and partly because they didn't trust anyone else to remember things correctly. Kings wanted lists, tribute lists, slave lists, maybe even grocery lists, if we're being honest. And from those dusty lists grew the notion of preserving knowledge. Now, if you're going to have a conversation about ancient libraries, you can't avoid Alexandria, the great celebrity of lost collections. The so-called Library of Libraries. The one everyone insists would have given us the secrets of the universe, if only it hadn't burned down. Which, by the way, it probably did several times. The library at Alexandria was established around the 3rd century BCE, under the Ptolemies, the dynasty of Greek kings who ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great stomped through the region and then promptly died, because of course he did. The Ptolemies were essentially Greeks cosplaying as pharaohs. They liked the throne, the temples, and the wealth, but not so much the Egyptian language. So, naturally, they poured money into building a monument to Greek culture. And that monument was a library. But not just any library. The Ptolemies wanted all the books. Every scroll in the known world. Their idea of a national acquisition strategy was theft. Ships docking at Alexandria were searched, and if they carried scrolls, those scrolls were confiscated, copied, and the originals kept. Travelers could kiss their reading material goodbye. A bit like airport security, but with fewer confiscated water bottles and more confiscated Aristotle. The sheer ambition was staggering. Some estimates say the library might have housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Now, bear in mind, a scroll wasn't a neat, printed book. It was usually a bit uneven, occasionally moldy, and written by someone who may or may not have been awake at the time. So imagine hundreds of thousands of those, crammed onto shelves, copied by harassed scribes who were probably underpaid and overinked. But here's the thing. The legend of Alexandria makes it sound like a cathedral of wisdom, where philosophers wandered in flowing robes, sipping something classy and debating eternal truths. In reality, it was run by humans. And humans are, unfortunately, messy. The scholars weren't all serene thinkers. Many were bitter academics, fighting over translations and hoarding credit for other people's ideas. Some were employed to edit texts, which mostly meant scratching out bits they didn't like. Improving Homer, as they called it, which was basically vandalism with a scholarly flair. And then there's the matter of how it all ended. People love to picture one great fire, maybe with Julius Caesar looking on dramatically. But the truth is, Alexandria's library was more of a slow-motion disaster. Caesar did indeed set part of the harbor aflame during his stay in Egypt, and yes, scrolls were lost. But there were also later attacks, periods of neglect, and possible deliberate purges. By the time of the Romans, the once legendary collection was more of a shabby ruin with a few scattered scrolls and a lot of nostalgia. The great treasure trove of human knowledge didn't vanish in one night. It simply eroded the way things usually do. Roofs leak, budgets get cut, dust piles up, and one day no one cares enough to fix it. But let's drift away from Alexandria, because there were other libraries. Smaller, stranger, less romantic, but perhaps even more revealing. One of my favorites is the Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. This was in the 7th century BCE, under the Assyrian Empire. Ashurbanipal was not the kind of king you'd want as a neighbor. He was violent, arrogant, and liked to carve his enemies' fates into stone reliefs, usually involving creative decapitations. But, oddly enough, he was also very proud of being literate. In fact, he may have been the only Assyrian king who could actually read and write. And what does a king do when he can read? He builds a library. Naturally. Ashurbanipal's library was full of cuneiform tablets, carefully collected, and sometimes stolen, from across Mesopotamia. Religious texts, omens, epics, medical recipes, the works. If it was on clay, he wanted it. The most famous survival from his collection is the Epic of Gilgamesh, a sprawling Mesopotamian story involving kings, gods, monsters, and the search for immortality. It's one of the earliest works of literature we have. And it only survived because Ashurbanipal was so keen on hoarding clay that archaeologists centuries later could dig it up. Again, though, let's not picture this as a hushed temple of learning. These tablets weren't neatly labeled by the Dewey Decimal System. They were often scattered, broken, and duplicated. A lot of the collection consists of omens. Thousands of omens. If a sheep gives birth to a two-headed lamb, here's what it means. Very important reading for an empire. Still, it was a library. A testament to the fact that humans, even very violent ones, like to keep records. Now, one might wonder, why did so many of these libraries disappear? Why aren't we surrounded today by scrolls of forgotten wisdom? The answer, of course, people. People destroy things. They lose interest. They build on top of ruins. They get distracted by more immediate concerns, like feeding themselves or not being stabbed. Papyrus and parchment also don't last forever. The climate of Egypt preserved some scrolls, but elsewhere, damp and insects did their work. Clay tablets held out longer, but only because clay doesn't mold, it just breaks. Which means our picture of ancient knowledge is always patchy, like an unfinished jigsaw puzzle. Sometimes, though, that's part of the charm. There's a kind of quiet poetry in the fragments. A half-line from a lost play. A recipe missing the final ingredient. A medical text that advises chanting loudly while applying herbs, as if volume itself had curative powers. The gaps remind us that history is not a neat story. It's more like a book eaten by moths. So, as you let your eyes drift a little heavier, imagine yourself walking through one of those libraries. Perhaps Alexandria, in its heyday. Scrolls stacked high, the air thick with dust and ambition. Scholars muttering in the corners, pretending they know Greek better than the guy next to them. A scribe sneezing into the papyrus he's meant to preserve for eternity. Or maybe Nineveh, where shelves of clay tablets press down on you with their sheer weight. Where the king, blood still on his sword, proudly shows you his prized omen texts, as if to say, yes, I slaughtered 3 cities, but look at this sheep liver diagram. These places weren't perfect. They weren't eternal. But for a moment in time, they held the hopes of people who wanted to preserve knowledge. And though most of it is gone, some fragments reached us. Enough to know they were there. Enough to imagine. Let's begin with the Ptolemies, since they're already lurking in the background of Alexandria. The dynasty began with Ptolemy I, a former general under Alexander the Great. After Alexander inconveniently died at 32, leaving behind more soldiers than heirs, his empire broke apart like a dropped vase. Ptolemy grabbed Egypt. And, naturally, because he had zero Egyptian blood, he immediately crowned himself pharaoh. The Ptolemies were the kind of family that thought cosplay counted as governance. They wore Egyptian crowns, posed in temples, and had themselves depicted as gods. Behind the scenes, though, they mostly spoke Greek through Greek-style parties and squabbled with each other over who got to sit on the throne, which usually involved poison, or daggers, or occasionally both. Now, the Ptolemies had a particular passion, collecting books. Not because they were necessarily great readers. No, it was more of a prestige thing. If you wanted to prove Egypt was still relevant, what better way than by amassing a gigantic hoard of scrolls? It's the royal equivalent of showing off your streaming subscriptions today. Oh, you only have 3 scrolls of Homer? We have 3,000. And we stole them from Athens, thank you very much. Ptolemy II, the successor, really leaned into this. He's sometimes called Ptolemy the Philadelphus, which sounds warm and friendly, until you remember the Greek root literally means sibling loving. And yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. He married his sister, Arsinoe, in the grand tradition of the family. Because when you can't decide between expanding the dynasty and marrying within it, you simply do both. Ptolemy II poured resources into expanding the library at Alexandria. He wanted it to be the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean. He funded scholars, imported scribes, and, of course, confiscated texts from visiting ships. Rumor even has it that he tried to get the official copies of Greek tragedies from Athens, on loan, supposedly, and then conveniently forgot to return them. Instead, he paid a fine and kept the originals. Athens got copies. Alexandria got bragging rights. This was, in essence, the royal approach to libraries. Part scholarship, part theft, all ego. But the Ptolemies weren't alone. Across the ancient world, kings and emperors treated libraries as status symbols. If you could rule an empire, you were expected to have at least a modest stockpile of scrolls. Not to read them, of course. That would be asking too much. But simply to own them. Take the Seleucid kings. This dynasty ruled much of the old Persian Empire after Alexander's death, stretching from Turkey to Iran. They weren't exactly known for stability. In fact, their family motto could have been, "Please revolt against us." But even they dabbled in collecting texts. Antiochus III, for instance, reportedly tried to poach scholars and texts for his court. Because what good is an empire if you don't have a few philosophers wandering around to make it look respectable? And then there were the Attalids of Pergamon. Yes, Pergamon. A city in Asia Minor, which would be largely forgotten today if not for one thing, parchment. Supposedly, when the Ptolemies tried to monopolize papyrus, because of course they did, the Pergamene shrugged and invented parchment from animal skins. This might be apocryphal, but it does fit the vibe of ancient kings sabotaging each other over stationery. Pergamon ended up with its own great library. Not quite as famous as Alexandria, but still prestigious. And when Mark Antony later gifted Cleopatra 200,000 scrolls from Pergamon's collection, it was less an act of love and more of an "I stole this for you" gesture. Which, in fairness, is probably the most Ptolemaic love language possible. Now, all of this collecting wasn't purely for show. At least not always. There were some rulers who genuinely cared about scholarship. Or, at the very least, wanted to appear intellectual in between their wars. Take the Roman emperors. Augustus, the first emperor, was famously careful about his image. He liked to present himself as cultured, balanced, the opposite of the chaotic Julius Caesar or the unhinged Antony. So, naturally, he sponsored libraries. The most notable was the Palatine Library in Rome. It was divided into 2 sections, one for Greek works and one for Latin, which was very tidy of him, as if knowledge could be split into neat boxes. Tiberius, his successor, had less enthusiasm, which is perhaps not surprising, given that Tiberius had less enthusiasm for almost everything, including ruling. Caligula, on the other hand, reportedly wanted to replace the heads of statues in public libraries with his own face, which is about as Caligulan as it gets. Less about books, more about, well, Caligula. Then there was Domitian, a later emperor, who tried to restore libraries that had been damaged by fire. nobilchus, but also slightly ironic, given that Domitian himself had a habit of persecuting philosophers. Nothing says, "I love knowledge," quite like rebuilding the shelves while exiling the people who write the scrolls. But perhaps the strangest royal collector of all was none other than Hadrian, the emperor best known for a wall in Britain that nobody asked for. Hadrian was, to put it gently, eccentric. He fancied himself a poet, an architect, and a philosopher, which meant he built libraries, wrote questionable verses, and then forced people to admire them. In Athens, he established a library that included lecture halls and reading rooms. It sounds civilized, and in many ways it was. But it was also Hadrian's way of saying, "Look at me, I'm Greek now." Because if there was one thing Hadrian loved more than Rome, it was pretending he was from Athens. His obsession with Greek culture bordered on cosplay, much like the Ptolemies. And so his library wasn't just a gift to the city, it was an ego project. The pattern is clear. Whether it was the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Attalids in Pergamon, or the emperors of Rome, royal libraries were less about public service and more about image. A kind of ancient PR campaign, bound in scrolls. Now, it's worth pausing here to note, these rulers weren't usually the ones reading. They had people for that. Slaves, scribes, scholars, men who would spend long hours copying texts by hand, sometimes without really understanding them. A scroll might be copied dozens of times, each with small errors creeping in, like a game of historical telephone. And yet, kings and queens like to take credit for the whole enterprise. If you imagine a Ptolemaic king striding through the library, surrounded by rows of scrolls, you can almost hear him thinking, "Yes, I personally own all this wisdom." Never mind that he couldn't be bothered to read half of it. It was enough to say it belonged to him. Ownership mattered more than understanding. It's a little like modern collectors of rare books. Sometimes the point is not to read them, but simply to know you've got the rarest copy sitting prettily on your shelf. Except in the ancient world, those shelves were usually made of wood, prone to collapsing under the weight of too many scrolls, which only adds to the charm. And of course, where there are royals, there are rivalries. Alexandria and Pergamon were constantly compared. Rome tried to outshine them both. Each wanted to be the cultural capital of the world, which meant that libraries, rather than being tranquil havens of learning, were essentially political weapons. Look at how civilized we are. Look at how many scrolls we've stolen from you. Sometimes these rivalries tipped into pettiness. For example, the story that the Ptolemies banned papyrus exports to Pergamon, forcing them to turn to parchment, may or may not be true. But the fact that people believed it says everything. Everyone assumed kings were petty enough to start a trade war over writing materials. Which, frankly, they probably were. So, as we drift further into this calm recounting, picture these rulers in their palaces. Ptolemy II, smugly hoarding tragedies from Athens. An Attalid king in Pergamon, admiring his parchment collection while glaring jealously at Alexandria. Augustus, carefully labeling Greek and Latin shelves like a nervous librarian. Caligula, measuring bust sizes to see which statues would look best with his own head glued on top. This was the world of royal collectors. Odd, vain, occasionally sincere. Libraries were their trophies. Not meant for you and me. Not even meant for most of their subjects. Just monuments to themselves, built in scrolls and clay. If you imagine a scribe in the ancient world, picture not a serene monk in a candlelit study, but rather someone perpetually covered in ink stains, squinting at faded texts, and silently cursing their employer. Writing was not glamorous. It was slow, painstaking. And if you made a mistake, you couldn't just hit backspace. You had to scrape the parchment, or worse, start again. In Mesopotamia, the scribes pressed wedges into wet clay tablets with a stylus. Thousands upon thousands of them. They trained for years in special schools, memorizing symbols until their hands cramped. The curriculum wasn't light either. Students had to copy lists of words, names of cities, descriptions of gods, endless multiplication tables. Imagine the most boring homework assignment of your life, repeated every day for a decade, and you're about halfway there. And what did you get for your trouble? Status, sometimes. Wealth, occasionally. But more often, a stiff back and the eternal gratitude of a king who would then take credit for your work. In Egypt, scribes had it slightly better. They wrote on papyrus, which at least spared them the joy of carrying around heavy clay tablets. Egyptian scribes were highly respected. The scribe does not sweat in the fields, boasted one old instructional text, probably written by a scribe who wanted to remind himself why his life wasn't terrible. But in practice, it still meant endless hours of copying religious texts, tax records, and letters dictated by someone with no idea how much work went into neat handwriting. There's a famous Egyptian tomb inscription where the owner brags about his scribe skills. He says something like, "No one surpasses me in writing," which is a polite way of saying, "Look, I wasted my eyesight for 40 years, so at least give me credit." By the time of Greece and Rome, scribes were often slaves or freedmen. Wealthy citizens might keep a small army of them, trained to copy texts on demand. Some Roman households had what we might call private publishing houses, churning out multiple copies of a book so the master could distribute them to friends. Of course, friends here often meant political allies who needed flattering, but the point stands. Cicero, the Roman statesman, relied heavily on his personal scribes. He wrote so many letters that without his secretaries, the world would probably never have heard half his thoughts. Which, depending on your opinion of Cicero, might have been a blessing. And yet, these scribes rarely appear in history. Their names were often omitted, erased, or buried in footnotes. The author got the glory. The scribe got cramped hands. In the grand libraries of the ancient world, scribes were essential. Remember the Ptolemies, with their habit of seizing scrolls from ships? Well, they didn't just shove them on shelves. First, they had to be copied. Originals went to the royal collection. Copies were returned, often imperfect, occasionally missing lines, sometimes altered by accident, which meant entire armies of scribes were employed to sit for hours in cramped rooms, rushing through copies so no one noticed the scroll switch. Some scholars think the sheer number of scribes at Alexandria was staggering. Imagine halls filled with men hunched over desks, copying Aristotle, Hippocrates, Homer. Not because they loved the words, necessarily, but because if they didn't meet their quota, they'd probably lose pay. Or worse. This copying system also introduced endless little errors into the texts we have today. A sleepy scribe might skip a line. The careless one might repeat a sentence. Sometimes, if a word looked odd, they would correct it to something more familiar, effectively rewriting the author on the spot. Over centuries, those mistakes multiplied. Which means when we read ancient text today, what we're really reading is a long game of telephone, filtered through generations of underpaid scribes. And then there were the marginal notes, the doodles, the snarky asides. Scribes occasionally wrote in the margins to complain about the length of the text, or to beg the reader for wine, or to grumble about the cold. One Irish monk centuries later scrawled, "This page was written in the snow," which is possibly the most relatable academic complaint in history. Though most ancient marginalia is lost, the fragments we do have remind us that scribes weren't just passive copy machines. They were people. Bored, tired, often sarcastic people. Which makes sense. Imagine copying a 600-line poem by hand, only to drop your stylus and smudge the ink. You'd probably mutter a few choice words too. It's tempting to think of scribes as invisible, but in some places, they wielded quiet power. In Mesopotamia, literacy was rare. Knowing how to read and write gave scribes a kind of gatekeeping authority. If you wanted a contract written, or a prayer recorded, you needed them. They controlled the written word. Kings commanded armies, but scribes commanded memory. Without them, history vanished. That's why some scribes left their own names on tablets. Little signatures tucked at the end. So-and-so wrote this. Almost like whispering across the centuries, "I was here. Don't forget me." Of course, many were forgotten. But the fact that any names remain shows how badly some scribes wanted recognition. Because if you've spent 20 years copying omens about sheep entrails, you deserve at least one footnote in history. Now, imagine the daily rhythm of a scribe's life. The room is dim. Light filters through narrow windows. Your tools are simple: reed pens, ink made of soot, a pile of papyrus or parchment. Maybe your back already hurts from yesterday's work. You start copying. Word after word. Line after line. Hours pass. Occasionally, you pause to stretch your fingers, or to sharpen the nib of your pen. Then you keep going. Outside, the city might be noisy. Merchants shouting, children playing, soldiers drilling. But inside the scribe's workshop, there's only the scratch of pen on surface. A rhythm so steady it could almost lull you to sleep, if you weren't the one forced to keep writing. And in that monotony, whole worlds were preserved. Epics, medical treatises, plays, boring tax ledgers. They all survived because someone, centuries ago, refused to put down their stylus. The irony, of course, is that these scribes did not always share in the glory of their work. When people praised Homer, they forgot the countless hands that recopied his verses. When they cited Hippocrates, they ignored the scribes who preserved his medical advice. The author became immortal. The scribe remained anonymous. And yet, without them, none of it would exist. Alexandria's shelves would have been bare. Pergamon's parchment would have been blank. The clay tablets of Nineveh would have crumbled into dust. History, in a sense, rests on their cramped hands and tired eyes. So, as you drift deeper into rest, imagine yourself as one of those scribes. You sit at a desk, ink pot beside you, scroll unrolling across your lap. You copy the words carefully, line by line. The work is slow but steady. Outside, the world is chaotic, wars, kings, rivalries. But inside, the only thing that matters is keeping the words alive. And in the end, those words may outlast the kings themselves, which is a quiet sort of victory.